in closing opposition, Graham and my extension is very clear. We tell you that first, grassroots Islamic feminist movements are the only way you can do this, and this means that any impediment you have to the goals of this movement is going to be problematic. What are we going to tell you in my speech? First, I'll give you a couple of rebuttals before I move on to my extension. Any other remaining rebuttal will be interwoven. Okay, so we get this idea that like, okay, you know, you need to be able to repair like the damage of it being inflicted upon you to some extent, and that violence is already existing in the status quo, right? So we tell you a couple of things, right? So you can look at it as the brilliant example of Black Panther that was talked about by closing government. This idea that, okay, look, they were radical and they were able to get through things, but recognize the ways in which rhetoric has shaped today, right? Any movement or any like idea that Black Lives Matter today like tries to portray is easily co-opted by the Black Panther movement, saying, oh look, that these people are trying to get violence, and they try to find any and all excuse to discredit the goals that have been achieved so far. But the problem is, recognize, Honorable Speaker, is that once you go violent, you cannot go back, right? Because that becomes the single defining image of your movement that conservatives can like continuously say that that's what you want and it's the only thing that you care about. This is problematic for a lot of reasons that opening tells you, right? But more important, we think that insofar as they agree that the power dynamics exist in the status quo, we don't understand how, when you now change the narrative, the only thing that you have, how you can get any form of recourse for these women. We'll talk to you a lot more about the depth that this debate requires in terms of grassroots Islamic feminism. Let's talk to you about it. So what do these movements look like, right? So we think that first and foremost that the idea that now you have like some individuals who have gone violent become the fundamental single like changing of the narrative of that structures this movement. The problem is on an individual level that feminists currently have a very stringent time or harder time to support these vigilante feminists. Why is this true? Because they don't understand, like I just don't get it, that Islamic feminists, the problem is these women have been for decades been able to campaign in the name of the religion. What does it look like? Recognize that honor killings are now outlawed in Pakistan. You probably think that's like still going on, but the fact that this legislation is in place means that there has been some progress. How was this progress achieved? It was achieved by mass protests by grassroots Islamic feminist movement, something that they don't understand. Secondly, we tell you the fact that like violence against transgender women and people are now outlawed in Pakistan were also done by these movements. Why is this the only way? The reason is, Penner, that these individuals find religion as a critical and like fundamental basis as they form their identity, right? They tell you that, look, recognize, when they talk to the patriarchy, as they call, they have a common denominator, right? The common denominator is religion. Because they tell you that, look, you need to support women's rights because God tells you to do so. They're able to use their religion as a political tool and a political project. Now, when you cloud this by saying that, oh, look, you now have to like support it against the law, it's not just this is against the law, it's also against their own religion and the fundamental values that shape the identity and the way they think that they're critical to their self-actualization. This means that now current feminists have to disobey and like separate themselves, even like the sort of the non-violent ways that they say you could support vigilante movements. But more importantly, it means that there's an internal conflict that stops like future feminists in these movements. The reason why this is important is because you literally fragmented the only movement that has had any success in the past century, right? And this is problematic. Now, why does this fragmentation really matter? It matters because, as Ankur says, that there are structural impediments to justice, right? That these are very patriarchally dominated, patriarchally constructed institutions. What does this look like, Banner? It really means that, like, sure, like, you don't have the laws of, like, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, but de jure and de facto discrimination still matters. I'll take you in a second. It means that you can probably still go wherever you want, but you have to take your father or your brother or your son's permission before you do so. These are things that are very ingrained in a way that you can't see. That means that women can't just leave the system because they're still realistically tied within the patriarchal norms and the way that they have been situated. But more importantly, it means that the only way you can have any form of justice this is by having conversations with women in these communities. Now, these women become delegitimized because the fundamental way that they're trying to say that, oh, feminism has already been colored by this idea of violent, radical tactics that exist in the process today. But lastly, we tell you also that this idea that what does this mean? It means that men in these communities have a very patriarchal understanding of what it means to be a woman, right? They want to keep them in the house and so on and so forth. The fact that now you say that the way you reach justice is by violence means it feeds into the narrative that says, oh yeah, right, you should stay in the house, because the moment you try to activate yourself and your rights advocacy, the way you go for it is violence. We think this means that the only recourse women in these individuals have on a fundamental individual level to get to convince other members of their communities for justice is gone. Ankur.
Okay, so we agree that violence is probably illegal in most communities. However, what we told you in opening government is that the way these societies exist, and you just conceded, women aren't able to access those methods of catharsis. How do they do that when vigilantes act on their behalf, when they're unable to operate within the system that you just described to be incredibly patriarchal?
Okay, true but misleading. Here's what I'm saying. We're saying that what is the status in women in these societies? You can look at Turkey, which you can say is probably a secular democracy, right? You can see how Erdogan has been able to recently rile a lot of anti-feminist, anti-women rhetoric. But the problem is there's a lot of apathy that exists in these communities, and now you turn that apathy to criminalization, right? We think that now you make women and you feed into the paranoia that men generally have against women in these communities. Why does this matter? It matters that now, if you had any form of grassroots, let's say meeting with women, that paranoia is multiplied and amplified, because now individuals don't want to meet with these women because they're probably trying to have a violent meeting of some sort. So we think that the only forms of recourse that you probably could have had is gone on your side of the house. At the end of my speech, Honorable Speaker, recognize a couple of things. We tell you that what you need to believe in this debate is that for decades and centuries, the only form of successive advocacy for rights for women and transgender people have come from long-term grassroots movements. Opening tells you on how that these grassroots movements matter, but in closing we tell you that the reason how you fragment is that you make women in these communities and the grassroots feminists have a critical identity issue in which they're not able to support this movement anymore because the religion matters so much to them, and the religion is the political project that which they galvanize their activism. More importantly, it feeds into the sexist narratives that women need to stay in these communities home, and they feed into the paranoia that men have, further entrenching any form. Yes, it's not mutually exclusive. The moment you make it violent, you make it a single identifier. That's why you ruin the only chance women in these communities have. All these reasons, very happy to oppose.
Thank the member of opposition for the government.
Ready? And sometimes it pays to be a liberal arts major. So the main problem we have on side opposition is a fundamental misunderstanding of how activist movements work, how they interact with systems to create change, and what the value of that change is. Mostly what we've done on side government for you is explain truths, and because those truths are true, we're going to be winning today's debate. So I'm going to give you a couple pieces of extraneous refutation. I'm going to give you 3 issues that I think kind of frame this debate. First, I think the top half was largely about deterrence and backlash. Second, I want to talk about what we can actually do for the victims specifically. They're a stakeholder that only government sides decided to care about. And thirdly, we're going to talk about how systems actually change, because I think my partner actually pre-butted 95% of the most recent speech we heard with his analogy of the Black Panthers and how radicals actually drive moderates to come to the decision-making, get to the negotiating table. First, extraneous rebuttal. All of side opposition is based on the idea that grassroots will solve. So then they have to be bold enough, as Carl Sagan would say, to ask the next question. How do grassroots movements solve? The problem here is that they give you a lot of examples of supposed progress that has happened, laws that have been changed. He tells you that honor killing is now illegal in Pakistan. He tells you that things like sexual assault and rape are illegal in countries. However, they still happen, and they happen at very high rates. India, which is largely a progressive democracy, or so we label it so often, has some of the strictest laws, especially in New Delhi, against rape in the world. Yet it is the gang rape capital of the world. It is where it is most commonly likely to occur. Problems are not necessarily solved when laws are passed. It's why opening opposition has been so far out of this round, because all they say is we need to pass laws, and obviously that doesn't create any kind of solvency, which they're so fundamental about. But the second thing the previous speaker tells you is that any idea that is radical will then become the only thing that that movement is associated with. One, my partner already told you this isn't true. So the Black Panther movement in the United States of America was able to drive the government to the negotiating table because governments are inherently self-interested, and the Black Panthers were the ones who threatened that self-interest, forcing them to have to change, because unless there is a catalyst for change, no social movement has any ability to gain change. And therefore, the image that actually is representative of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, the most stereotypical example that we all seem to know here in the United States, is actually the face of that movement. So historically, this is just factually not true, but it's also based on the premise that you need a villain to become an oppressor. Obviously, this isn't true because sexism exists, right? Like, fundamentally, in these nations, they are treating women as if they are lesser, treating them as if they are subhuman. They don't seem to need a radical feminist movement to have this treatment. So if this kind of evil can be perpetuated anyway, why do you need a villain to point to perpetuate the evil? I don't think this makes sense. Top half of the debate is about deterrence v. backlash. We think that our opening government does a good job of talking about fear. They say specifically that right now the problem is that women who live so thoroughly in fear, they have no mechanism to get within the system. We agree with this, and I think that Sklar actually forwards this for you when he comes up here and talks about the severity of identity damage that happens to individuals, right? Like literally every conversation a sexual assault survivor has with every other individual is tainted by the fact that they feel as though they are unsafe. Your fundamental ability to feel safe in a society is what is being shattered when you are sexually assaulted, and particularly when the system does not do anything to change that sexual assault. That tells you two things. One, that you in fact have violence against you and there is inherent psychological trauma with that. But two, the system clearly doesn't care about you because they did nothing to stop that trauma. We see this even in nations as progressive as Ireland and the United States of America, wherein most sexual assaults tend to go unreported. In fact, 82% of sexual assaults go unreported, and the ones that do have a stunning conviction rate of 0.02%. Obviously, the system does not have to be explicit to be effective, which is why this argument about backlash seems to be almost impactless. Fundamentally, in the status quo, which they on opposition are defending, there are such significant harms that seem to be the bedrock of what both teams are trying to fix in this debate. And yet they tell you somehow the evil thing will do evil if you pass the motion. Well, yeah, they were gonna do that anyway, like, right? Of course they will, and we think that's the problem. Unless they can fix it more compelling than we can, that was my very first POI to the opening speaker, they can't possibly win this debate. So secondly, let's talk about what we can do for the victims' top half.
Thanks. Okay. Where does your right to vigilante justice end? Does it still stand in a nation with enforced laws where rape still occurs but the attacker can be punished in court? We told you how this harms other women, but you claim this isn't sufficient. Why is that trade-off not true?
So one, it's not a trade-off. It's two different things that you are saying have to be mutually exclusive, and I don't know why it's true. Secondarily, I would tell you that your right to vigilante justice as an individual comes from the damage that was done to you and the injustice of the society to be able to do that for you. What Sklar tells you about the social contract, and this is getting into my second point, what Sklar tells you about the social contract is that the reason why we agree to be complacent in individuals' laws is fundamentally because they are guaranteeing our right to safety and a degree of prosperity in trade for us buying into their system. If that right to safety is not upheld, we no longer have the moral obligation to follow the laws of the system. This is like Thomas Hobbes solved this like a long time ago, right? Like this has been solved long before now. The problem is that if the system cannot protect you, you have no moral obligation to that system, and for some reason they think that prima facie you have to perpetuate the systems that are in fact the ones who are oppressing you. We don't think this is true. What can we do for victims? We think the top half gets the ball rolling in the deputy speech when they start talking about how like catharsis is valuable. We think it's more than catharsis because we think the victims actually have inherent identity damage that can be fixed because of how it relates to power. What Solar tells you is that the act of sexual assault is not one of necessarily just saying that you are lesser, but it's one of actively removing any kind of power that you feel you have within the system. There's only one way to correct that, and that's to demonstrate your power and prove that that's just fundamentally not true. You have the ability to act. We do this in the very way that power was taken from them by being retributive. We say that no, you as the victim of sexual assault have a right to that power, and you're going to exert that power on the society that has so firmly harmed you. We think this is fundamentally just, and we don't think it's really been contested in this round, so I don't have to back it up anymore, and I can move on instead to how systems actually change. Because there is a large question of solvency that percolates throughout this entire debate, and I think that Solar gives you the best picture of how that will actually happen when he talks about how the radical drives the oppressor to the negotiating. The problem with the opposition bench is that they have no ability for people who are going to do bad things to stop doing bad things. They tell you that they will, but they also tell you that things like grassroots movements that exist in the status quo, resistance movements that are peaceful, which have existed for the history of the status quo, will somehow solve for problems in the status quo. It makes no sense. Fundamentally, when we're talking about how systems change, there has to be a catalyst for change. We think this kind of radicalism, we think this kind of vigilantism is a catalyst for change, and Solar tells you why. The reason why a power structure, the that is fundamentally concerned with the state keeping its own power would have to come to the table is because when that state has its power threatened, the one thing it first and foremost cares about, that is when it has to take action, because states care about their own self-preservation. If you are for the rule of law, and the most important thing for you is that your laws be followed, not following the law, i.e. vigilantism, is the greatest possible threat to you that an individual can do. It's why it's the catalyst for action. We also think that because these systems will want to still have some degree of power, they're not just immediately going to collapse and shuffle into a radically violent coup. What they will do is they will go to the people who are the catalyst for this revolution and say, all right, what do you need? That's how Martin Luther King got to the table in an incredibly racist government, because the radicals forced the catalyst, and then the movement got a chance to negotiate at the table. Unless they can prove this kind of change on their side of the house, and let's face it, that's not reality, we know that you're going to be voting for government in today's debate.
Let's call the opposition whip to conclude today.
Speaker ready? Everybody ready? A little bit patronizing for government whip to come up here and say, honor killings still happen in Pakistan when they were banned a month, 2 months ago. Yeah, honor killings do still happen in Pakistan. Big whoop. The Black Panthers engaged in their advocacy 40 years on, and we still are not meeting basic questions for our black population in the country, like housing, like employment, like healthcare. Right? These are all long-term impacts for solvency. So he cannot couch the point on on honor killings in that way. I'm going to start off with a little bit of rebuttal, and then go into sort of rebuilding and crystallizing the analysis that Rifat exclusively gives you. We think our friend Hafta did a good job of mentioning that Islamic feminism does exist. Yes, thank you. But Rifat gave you the exclusive characterization of the work that these movements do within the patriarchal structures that characterize many of these societies, how they are uniquely harmed by violent vigilantism, and why they are therefore mutually exclusive with them, and why the backlash is disproportionate not only to women physically, but to future feminist movements. So let's get into it. Right? So we think that basically the OOs, or the OGs, OG's arguments are basically all based in catharsis and the value of catharsis, you get your identity back, you get your agency back, cool, right? But we think that all of these are warrantless because what every Gov speaker failed to entertain is what happens to these women after they carry out vigilante justice, right? We think two things happen, right? Either they're in disguise and somehow their identities can't be identified, right? And then this happens a lot, that masked attackers are attacking men in backroom deals, in backrooms, right? And we think that so we think that's bad because in the sense where a man's testimony is often prioritized over a woman's in a country like Turkey or like Iran, we think that the legal system is going to believe the men that somebody did this, right? And we think the retribution for that is going to be enormous. And we think if it's the victim actually carrying out this retribution, right, and is identifiable to the perpetrator, then we think they probably go to jail, right? Catharsis means nothing if you have the last shreds of autonomy remaining to you curtailed because you've been arrested, right? So whether or not the perpetrators of vigilantism are identified, right, they lose on that point. No government speaker mentioned that whatsoever, right? So we think that they lose on the deterrence, right? Because even if because Anker tried to make this point, right, that then it was kind of implicit, he didn't even make it, but if he had made the point that this would discourage men from doing this, right, that the fear of violence would discourage them, no, at the point when the legal system is stacked in their favor, right, further violence, stronger violence against women becomes disincentive for women not to engage in this, right? Because the legal system is always going to be on the side of the men, right? And it's until we change the legal system, which are the benefits that Rifat brought you, right? No thank you. So why do nonviolent grassroots movements matter the most? We think, again, that the opening did a good job of mentioning that these things exist, but we think that the crucial analysis came out of Rifat's speech, why they must be prioritized, right? We think that the example of the honor killing ban in Pakistan, right? It didn't happen by killing men who committed honor killings, right, Honorable Speaker? That didn't happen. That doesn't happen. We think that nonviolent grassroots movements are unique in that they agitate for political and structural change by way of changing minds at the individual level, right? This is distinct from vigilante vigilantism. So I'm going to explain this a little bit, right? We think that the value of nonviolent grassroots movements, or that the conversations that change people's minds, come at the level of talking to your female family members, right? Understanding their concerns, understanding the ways that they think about these things, and then the punishment coming from the legal system or restructuring of the moral system to say, no, honor killings are not Islamic. No, honor killings are not moral in the system that you believe, right? We think that the punishment and those conversations have to come separately, right? Because when the punishment comes from the people who are being oppressed in the first place, all that does, Honorable Speaker, is re-entrench the narrative that these are people that need to be kept down, right? We have to separate these things. It's the only way to do it. It has worked in Pakistan, and we do not think that the fact that honor killings still continue 2 months after they've been banned,